The red dust of Kansas never fully settled in Wichita. Even on the coolest days, it hung in the air like a tangible ghost, clinging to skin, seeping into lungs, marking everything with that color of rust and abandonment. In the summer of 1978, the city carried the weight of a drought that had stretched for 3 consecutive years, and with it, stories that the elders preferred not to tell after sunset. Sarah Milligan was 17 when she first heard about the Burlap sack man. It was on a stifling July afternoon when her grandmother Martha came to visit them at her parents' farm. The old woman had those watery eyes that seemed to see beyond the visible world, and her hands trembled constantly, as if they were always pushing away something invisible. Sitting on the porch, fanning herself with a straw fan, Martha looked at the horizon where the wheat fields were dying under the relentless sun and murmured, "Hallel, come back. When the land dries up like this, when there's nothing left to harvest, he always comes back." Sarah didn't pay much attention at the time. Ghost stories were common in that region, passed down from generation to generation as the bitter legacy of land that charged dearly from those who dared to cultivate it. But something in her grandmother's voice, a particular tremor in those words, made the young woman remember them when, 3 weeks later, she found the first scratches on the back door of the house. There were 5 parallel lines, deep in the wood, as if claws had run across the surface from top to bottom. The green paint was peeling at the edges of the grooves, revealing the light wood underneath. Sarah ran her fingers over the scratches, feeling the raised splinters, and a chill ran down her spine despite the 100-degree heat. Her father, Thomas Milligan, examined the marks with a closed expression and declared it must have been a raccoon or perhaps a stray dog. But Sarah noticed that he locked the door more carefully that night and that his hand trembled slightly as he turned the key. The Milligans weren't the only ones. Throughout that week, Sarah heard comments in town. Mrs. Henderson, who owned the grocery store on Main Street, mentioned that something had scratched the door of the grain story. Old Peterson, who lived alone 5 miles from town, told people at the gas station that he'd woken to strange noises on the porch and found identical marks on his door in the morning. Always 5 lines, always deep, always during the night. That's when Sarah decided to ask more about the story. She found Martha on a Thursday afternoon at the nursing home where her grandmother spent her days between card games and endless naps. The old woman was lucid that day, her eyes sharp despite her age. When Sarah mentioned the scratches, Martha stopped shuffling the cards and her expression hardened. "Did you see him?" asked her grandmother, her voice a hoarse whisper. "See what?" "The scratches," Sarah replied, confused. "No. Him? The man?" And then Martha told a story that had been buried in silences and half-words for almost 50 years. In 1929, during the Great Depression, a farmer named Ezekiel Thorne lived with his wife and 3 children on a property on the outskirts of Wichita. He was a hard-working man, stern but fair, who had built everything from nothing. His wheat fields were the most productive in the region, his cattle breeding enviable. But then came the crisis, and with it, the drought. In 2 years, Ezekiel lost everything. First, the cattle killed by lack of pasture. Then the harvest, which dried up still green under the merciless sun. The bank took the property. His wife, unable to bear the misery, left with the children one winter night, leaving only a letter on the kitchen table. Ezekiel found it at dawn, read its words only once, and something inside him broke irreparably. Neighbors said he wandered the empty farm for weeks, talking to himself, conversing with people who didn't exist. He refused help, refused food. Then, one March morning, he disappeared. A few days later, A boy playing near the abandoned property saw him for the first time, walking through the devastated fields, dragging a rusty hoe with a burlap sack completely covering his head. "Why the sack?" Sarah asked, mesmerized by the narrative. Martha looked at her with those eyes that saw too much. They say he couldn't bear to look at what he'd become, or maybe he couldn't bear for the world to see him. The sack had 2 irregular holes for the eyes, torn with his own hands. And they said that behind those holes there was no humanity left at all. For weeks, Ezekiel was spotted wandering the region, always at dusk or during the night, always with the sack covering his face, always dragging that hoe that left an irregular furrow in the dry earth. Children ran inside when they saw him in the distance. Adults locked their doors and closed their curtains, but no one called the sheriff. No one tried to help him. It was as if everyone knew instinctively that Ezekiel Thorne had crossed a boundary from which there was no return. It was little Annie Kearns who first reported the scratches. She was 7 years old and slept in the back room of her parents' house. One April night, she woke to the sound of scraping against wood. She looked out the window and saw a silhouette standing in the yard, motionless, with the burlap sack swaying slightly in the wind. The figure held the hoe with both hands and seemed to be looking directly at her, though in the dark it was impossible to be sure. Annie screamed. Her parents came running, but when they reached the window, there was no one there, only the scratches on the back door, 5 deep lines in the wood. After that, the reports multiplied, always following the same pattern: footsteps during the early morning hours, the characteristic sound of something being dragged across the ground, scratches on doors in the morning, and the sightings. People swore they saw the figure on the periphery of their properties, always watching, always motionless, always with that sack covering his face and the 2 dark holes where the eyes should be. Sheriff Bolton finally decided to act in May of that year. He gathered a group of volunteers and went looking for Ezekiel Thorne. They found him on the old Thorne property, sitting on what remained of the main house's porch. The building was in ruins, the roof partially collapsed, the walls peeling. Ezekiel was there, with the sack on his head, the hoe across his lap, completely motionless. Bolton approached cautiously, speaking in a low voice, as if approaching a wild animal. Ezekiel Thorne. I'm Sheriff Bolton. We need to talk, son." "People are worried." There was no response. The figure remained seated, the burlap sack rippling gently. Bolton extended his hand to touch the man's shoulder, and that's when Ezekiel moved. In a sudden and violent motion, he stood up, holding the hoe like a weapon. He said Nwarji made no sound at all, just stood there in a threatening posture. The volunteers stepped back, hands instinctively going to the weapons some carried. Bolton raised his hands in a pacifying gesture. "It's okay, Ezekiel. Nobody's going to hurt you. We just want to help you." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Ezekiel lowered the hoe. He turned and walked into the ruined house, disappearing into the darkness of the interior. Bolton took a step to follow him, but one of the volunteers, an old farmer named Hutchinson, grabbed his arm. "Let him go, Sheriff," Hutchinson said, his voice laden with something that seemed like fear. "There are things in this world that are better left alone." Bolton hesitated, but something about the atmosphere of that place, the way the shadows seemed thicker, the way the silence weighed on everything, made him agree. They left Ezekiel Thorne behind and returned to town. The sightings continued throughout that summer. Ezekiel was seen wandering the abandoned fields, always at nightfall, always alone. The scratches appeared on doors throughout the region. And then, in September, everything stopped. Ezekiel simply disappeared. He was no longer sighted. The scratches ceased. The nocturnal footsteps fell silent. When autumn came, some brave men went to the old Thorn property to investigate. They found the house completely empty. There were no signs of Ezekiel, no belongings, nothing. Only the hoe, leaning against the wall of what had been the main room, and on the wooden floor, deep scratches as if he had spent days scraping the surface with his own fingernails. "Did he die?" Sarah asked when Martha paused in the narrative. Her grandmother shrugged. "Nobody knows. They never found a body, but people say he never really left. That when the land gets dry, when there's desperation in the air, when someone loses everything like he lost, he'll come back like a warning, like a curse, like the reflection of what we all can become when hope dies." Sarah felt a shiver. "Do you believe that?" Martha looked at her for a long time before answering. "I saw him once. I was your age, maybe a little younger. It was in 1932, 3 years after he disappeared. I woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound. I went to the window, and there he was in our yard, with that damned sack on his head, holding the hoe. We stared at each other for what seemed like an eternity. And then he just vanished like smoke. The next morning, our door was scratched. What did you do? What any sensible person would do. I never looked out the window in the middle of the night again." Sarah left the nursing home with more questions than answers. The story of Ezekiel Thorn disturbed her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. There was something deeply tragic about it, but also something threatening, as if the line between victim and monster had completely dissolved in that broken man. During the following weeks, the scratches continued to appear. More houses were marked, always during the night, always the same pattern. The police were called, but found no explanations. Some attributed it to animals, others to vandals. But Sarah knew, everyone knew, even if few would admit it out loud. It was on an August night that Sarah woke to the sound. It was about 3 in the morning, and something was being dragged outside the house. A rhythmic, heavy sound, like metal scraping on earth. Her heart immediately accelerated. She lay in bed, blankets pulled up to her chin, trying to convince herself it was just the wind, just her imagination. But the sound continued, slowly approaching the house. Then came the footsteps. Slow, dragging, uneven, climbing the steps of the back porch. Stopping before the door, Sarah could barely breathe. Every cell in her body screamed for her to stay quiet, not to move, not to look. But something stronger than fear, a primal need to face danger head-on, made her get out of bed. She moved silently to her bedroom window, which overlooked the backyard. The curtains were partially closed, leaving only a narrow gap. Sarah approached slowly, her heart beating so hard she was sure it could be heard from outside. She pressed her face against the wall and peeked through the gap. He was there, a tall figure, thin beyond natural, wearing tattered clothes that seemed decades old, and over his head, a burlap sack tied loosely around the neck with 2 irregular holes where the eyes should be. In the silvery light of the nearly full moon, Sarah could see that the sack was stained and dirty, and that the hands holding the rusty hoe were abnormally long and thin. The figure stood before the back door, completely motionless. Sarah couldn't see the face behind the sack, but she knew he was looking at the door, watching, waiting. And then, slowly, the figure raised one of its hands and extended its fingers toward the wood. Sarah could see the nails, long and broken, almost like claws. In a deliberate motion, the figure ran its fingers down the door from top to bottom, producing that horrible sound of nails scratching wood. Once, twice, 3, 4, 5 times, 5 parallel lines deep in the wood. And then the figure stopped. Slowly, very slowly, the head covered by the sack began to turn. Sarah felt her stomach sink when she realized what was happening. The figure was turning toward her window, toward her. Every instinct screamed for her to pull away, to close the curtains, to hide under the bed like a frightened child. But Sarah was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to look away. The head continued turning until the 2 dark holes in the sack were pointed directly at her. For an interminable moment, Sarah and the figure stared at each other through the window and the darkness. There were no visible eyes in the holes of the sack, only deep and impenetrable darkness. But Sarah could feel the gaze, could feel being seen, being observed, being evaluated. And there was something in that invisible gaze that went beyond common fear. It was like being seen by something that was no longer entirely human, something that had crossed a boundary and now existed in a space between worlds. Then the figure did something that froze Sarah's blood. Slowly, deliberately, it raised one of its hands and pointed at her, the thin, dirty finger pointing directly at her face through the window. And though no sound was emitted, though the figure remained completely silent, Sarah heard a voice in her mind. Not exact words, but a sensation, a knowledge that was implanted directly in her consciousness. I see you, I see all of you, and when you lose everything, when nothing remains, when the land dries up and hope dies, I'll be waiting. The figure lowered its hand, turned slowly, and began to walk away from the house, dragging the hoe behind it. The sound of metal scraping on earth echoed through the silent yard. Sarah watched it move away, its silhouette getting smaller and smaller, until it finally disappeared completely into the darkness between the trees. Sarah didn't sleep for the rest of that night. She sat on the bed, hugging her knees, watching the window until the first rays of sun began to brighten the sky. Only then did she dare to leave the room. Her parents were still asleep. She went downstairs silently and went to the back door. The scratches were there, 5 deep lines, fresh in the wood. Sarah ran her fingers over them, feeling the raised splinters, and tears she didn't know she was holding began to roll down her face. They weren't tears of fear, though fear was certainly present. They were tears of a deep and inexplicable sadness, as if she had touched something fundamental about human nature, about what happens when we break beyond repair. In the days that followed, Sarah didn't tell anyone what she'd seen. Not her parents, not her friends, not even Grandma Martha. Some knowledge was too heavy to share. Some experiences changed you in ways that words couldn't capture. But she never looked out the window at night again. And when she heard footsteps in the early morning hours, she buried her head in the pillow and waited for morning to come. The scratches continued to appear sporadically throughout that summer and into the autumn that followed. Then, gradually, they became less frequent. Winter came, and with it rains that finally broke the drought. Spring brought renewed harvests. Life continued as it always continues, but Sarah never forgot. And when, decades later, her own grandchildren asked her about the old stories of Wichita, about the hard times and the urban legends that persisted, she told them about the Burlap sack man, about Ezekiel Thorne, who lost everything and became something more and less than human, about the scratches that appeared on doors during hard times, about the footsteps in the early morning and the figure that watched from the shadows. And she always ended with the same warning that Martha had given her so many years ago. Never look out the window in the middle of the night, because if he's there, if you see him, he'll look back. and a part of him will stay with you forever, reminding you of what we all can become when we lose everything. When hope dies, when we cross that line from which there is no return. The scratches still appear occasionally in Wichita, always 5 lines, always during the night, always in times of hardship and desperation. And those who know the story, those who carry the knowledge passed down through generations, know what they mean. They know that Ezekiel Thorne still walks the dry fields, dragging his hoe, wearing his burlap sack, waiting, always waiting. A dark reflection of our own capacity for despair. A reminder that the line between man and monster is thinner than we'd like to believe. And if you live in Wichita, or visit on a dark night, and you hear dragging footsteps outside and something being scraped on the ground, ... Don't look out the window. Please, don't look, because he's still there. Always has been, always will be. The burlap sack man, lost between worlds, neither alive nor dead, waiting for others to join him in the shadows where hope goes to die.